Confluence, and we'll get into that. But before I get into that, we're going to have some housekeeping. So the first thing is that if your phone is on, let's put it on silent. Other than that, download the app if you already haven't, so that you can fill out a survey at the end and also see what other tracks are available. This next talk is kind of near dear to my heart because I'm a big Confluence fan. So we have Klaus. He's a senior developer and team lead on the ecosystem team, and so he's going to be talking about Confluence. And a little bit of fun fact, he's from the Arctic Circle, very cold place, but he hates the cold. So he moved to Australia and then California. He also is a bass player, and so somehow I'm going to start a band at Atlassian. He's going to be in it. He doesn't know this yet. All right, so without further ado, Klaus.
Thank you. Yeah, hi, I'm Klaus. I work in Confluence, and I want to tell you about the first time I actually used Confluence. This was about 6 years ago, and I had just joined a small Australian tech company, and they were using Atlassian products, including Confluence. And as soon as I started using Confluence, I really loved it. It enabled me to share my plans and my ideas with the team I was working with. And, but looking back at that time, I was actually a bit shit at using Confluence. I was barely using half of its features. I didn't know what you could do in Confluence. Just to give you an example, so I was in this architect type of role, and being an architect required me to do a lot of diagrams to try to make sense of the big ball of mud code base we had back then. And, but I didn't know about all the kind of diagramming tools that there are, for example, Draw.io and Glyphy, nor did I know that you could actually integrate them with Confluence. So what I did instead is I took a piece of paper, I draw my diagrams on this piece of paper. If I made a mistake, I crumbled them, threw them away, started again, and draw these. And then when I was done, I took my phone, took a photo of the diagram, emailed it to myself, took the email attachment, and put it on into a Confluence page. I did this for about 2 years, and then I joined Atlassian and the Confluence team, and I actually saw what you can do with Confluence, and I kind of felt, yeah. So this brings it to me to my topic today, because back then, I could still kind of get shit done, even with my limited knowledge, but I wasn't truly productive the way how I really wanted to be. And the ecosystem and all the things that it can bring to Confluence is the kind of key part that can really help make people who are in the same position as I was back then be more productive. And so if we look at our ecosystem today, there's roughly 3 categories of apps that we have. First off, we have apps that actually bring more features and more value directly into Confluence by providing more features. Let's say Refine Wiki through theming, Comalatech through workflows, Nearsoft by bringing a lot of agile tools straight into Confluence. The second category is products that live on their own or work as standalone apps in the cloud, but they also integrate directly within Confluence. Like, for example, Glyphy diagrams in Confluence pages, or you can have Google Spreadsheets in Confluence. And then the last category is kind of products that live on the side of Confluence and integrate directly with Confluence. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on the last 2 categories. And first, I'm going to focus on this one. So let's say you have a cloud product that your customers use and they love it. It provides them a lot of value. And let's say your customers also use Confluence. And how they work with Confluence and your product is by taking a link and copy-pasting it from the browser into a Confluence page. This is kind of a clear signal that you need to bring your product into Confluence. The way to do it is to use macros. Macros is the tool in Confluence that makes Confluence more than just a text editor. Macros allow you to put rich content straight into a Confluence page. But to talk about macros, I want to explain a bit about the new editor experience we're bringing to our customers in Confluence. The reason why we're redoing the editor in Confluence is because, well, there's more competition, and we want to make a more usable editor, but that still has all the power features and capabilities that our customers love in Confluence. Probably the first thing you notice in the new editor is that macros appear now in the edit mode, same as they do on a published page. For example, in this case, the roadmap or the Jira issue macros look the same as they do when you publish a page. The second thing we've added into the Confluence editor is a slash menu that allows you easily to add these macros and other extensions like dates and mentions into the Confluence page in a much more usable manner and search them. And now, for the first time, for third-party developers, your macros no longer look like these ugly gray boxes, but instead they appear on the page exactly as they do on a published page. To explain how you can make these live macros and WYSIWYG macros, I want to kind of explain a bit about the Atlassian Connect framework. This is the framework that you can use to develop apps to Confluence, but also other Atlassian products. The key part in Connect add-on is, or Connect app, is the Atlassian Connect JSON file. This is your app descriptor. It tells what your app will do in the product and where it's located and which modules it is actually bringing into Confluence or Jira. The key part there is the base URL, which says where your own product server is located, and then the modules that it's adding. Once you've defined your app descriptor, you can upload it to our marketplace, and when an admin is installing your add-on, Confluence gets it from the marketplace and then knows to talk to your product server. To define a macro using the Connect framework, you need to do a module called Dynamic Content Macro. In a Dynamic Content Macro, the key part there is the macro URL. This URL tells Confluence where it needs to load the content for the macro. So when a user loads a page that has a Connect macro defined on it, Confluence makes a call to the URL you've defined in your app descriptor, and your product needs to return an HTML page back to Confluence that Confluence then embeds as an iframe into the page, both in the editor and the view. To make a macro live or WYSIWYG, it needs to be bodiless. Essentially, there cannot be a body type in the macro anymore, which then Confluence now loads then as an iframe in a page. One thing also that has changed if you've developed macros before is that there is no need to set the sizing for macros anymore, because the editor has 3 different distinctive sizes for a macro. The one where it's 680 pixels wide, like the content, but there's possibility to also make it slightly wider or full page. There's one other feature that we've added into the Connect framework, which is the ability to make macros or other iframes cacheable. To make macros cacheable, you need to set them true, set the cacheable flag true in the app descriptor, and then this tells Confluence not to ask for any, or not to put any URL parameters when it's loading the macro. But because the URL parameters were, for example, things like the authentication token or the other context for the macro were previously, you need to now use a JavaScript API to access these. There's one JavaScript API to get the token to make authenticated REST calls, and a second one to get the actual context parameters like the page ID or the space key and others. There was a talk earlier today about the cacheable iframes by Dougal tomorrow. I think it's being recorded, so I recommend checking this out, especially if you're interested in making your iframes more performing. There's a couple of things to do and avoid doing when developing macros. First thing is to start thinking on how to make your macros work in a WYSIWYG case, where they do the same thing both in the editor and in a published page. Second thing to do is set the height of the macro in CSS directly. Previously, you could set the width and the height in the app descriptor, but we've changed it so that the width is now in the editor, like I showed, and the height would be set in the CSS directly. And if you're caching your macro performance, you can already set the height in the static content that is loaded when a macro is client-side cached, which reduces the kind of popping of up and down on a page when the iframes are loaded there. Things we recommend avoiding is using bodied macros, putting any sort of rich text in a macro. This kind of takes away from the WYSIWYG feel that we're intending in the new editor, and we generally like our users to avoid it. It's still possible to do it, but you need to have a specific use case for this where I would recommend doing this. And a second thing which is related is showing different content in view and edit mode of the page. This again reduces the WYSIWYG feel of the editor, so we recommend not doing this. There are a couple of other ways how you can extend Confluence. I'm not going to go in depth into these, but there are API documentation available and tutorials on these, and I'm happy to talk about more on this later on. But the two other ways are using custom content. Custom content is a way to define completely new content types within Confluence. For example, think about spreadsheets or presentations, but instead of embedding these into a page, they would live in the information hierarchy on the same level as a page or a blog post or other native Confluence content types do. And then there are page extensions. These are ways how you can add hooks into the UI and implement your different points like in menus or admin pages that you can add iframes or small hooks into in Confluence pages. So I talked about macros and how you can actually bring more content into the Confluence page. Next, I want to take you back again those 6 years. 6 years ago, Spain won the European Championship in football. 6 years ago, Psy's Gangnam Style was a #1 hit. It got more than 1 billion views in YouTube, the first ever video to do so. And also, I was still pretty shit at using Confluence. Confluence wasn't, though, the only tool we were using. We were also starting to use a new and upcoming chat tool called Slack for instant messaging and chatting within the team. And we were also working with a third company who we couldn't give access to our Confluence instance with all my hand-drawn beautiful diagrams. So instead we used Google Docs to share information between them. But all these products kind of lived in isolation. So there was a lot of copy-pasting happening around. We were copy-pasting Confluence pages or the content there to Google Docs. We were copy-pasting links to Slack and so on to share information. And this is still a big use case today. This happens still today. And if you have a product where you feel like there's a need to actually sync with Confluence or get notification, that is a sign that you need to bring Confluence and integrate Confluence with your existing product. To talk more about this, I want to use as an example the new Slack integration we've built using the Connect framework and the same tools that are available for you. The basic idea in the Slack integration is that you can subscribe to a Confluence page or a space and get notifications from a Confluence page. But Confluence does not have the ability to talk directly to Slack. So it needs something in between to actually do the translations between those two. The way to get notifications out of Confluence is to use a module in Connect framework called webhooks. Webhooks are a pair of event types like page created, page edited, comment created, comment edited, and so forth, and a URL, which is the callback URL that when one of these events happens, Confluence calls that URL, makes a post to your app server. The content of the webhooks is which page was edited. For example, in the case of page created event, which page was created, which space did it happen, when did it happen, and who did the change. Using this information then, you can query more information using the Confluence REST API to actually get more information, and then populate this information and send the notification directly into your product. This is what the Slack integration essentially does when it's sending notifications. There's a couple of recommendations we have when working with webhooks. First is check the restrictions of the content you are fetching. We generally want to avoid or recommend not leaking data, because this reduces the trust that your users have on us, but also on your product. Second thing, because especially if your app is very popular, there will be a lot of calls made from Confluence to your product. So you don't want to do a lot of resource-heavy things like accessing database or other things on every single webhook. So you want to some way filter the webhooks that you don't need to action with. And the last part is inform your user when they are using your integration, what information are they about to send out. This increases the trust that the users have with the product you're developing. Things to avoid is using user impersonation when fetching content. This allows you to go through the restrictions that they might have set, and again, if you use this, it will reduce the trust. Second thing we recommend not to do is spam the Confluence APIs. Just don't DDoS us. Okay, so once you have notifications going, probably the next thing you want to do is actually interact more with Confluence. In the Slack integration, there is an ability to leave a comment directly on a Confluence page using the Slack integration. But to leave a comment, you need to sync the two user bases. Basically, Slack has a different user base than a Confluence has, and this is probably true if you have a standalone product also. So there needs to be a sync. So when a user tries for the first time to reply to a comment or leave a comment to a Confluence page, we ask the user to link their account. When a user clicks the button, it takes them to a Confluence page, which is a general page module in the Connect framework that asks the user to link those two accounts, asks them to authorize the linking, and tells what about this kind of information are they authorizing the app to do, and then Confluence or the integration sends a message back to the app server, storing the two pieces of information needed to actually link the users, the Atlassian ID and then the Slack's user ID, or whatever way your product might be storing the information. Once the link is set, we inform the user that the linking is successful, and then the user has the ability to leave a comment. When the user writes the comment and clicks the comment button, Slack sends, using its whatever API, a message to the app server, and then the app server uses the Confluence REST API and the user impersonation capability that it has to actually create the content as the user who actually did this in Slack. At the end, I want to highlight one solution that has been developed by Hugo, which is a meeting note solution, and they've developed in the last app week in Portland an integration between Confluence and their product, and it utilizes these features that we also are using in the Slack application nicely. So Slack is a meeting note solution that allows you to create meeting notes between organizations. So for example, in this case, a meeting between Atlassian and Hugo, there is a meeting notes page created in the Hugo application, and within the Hugo meeting note, there is a possibility to create this directly in Confluence by setting it to save a page and then this takes you to the Confluence editor with the page created there. If there are some comments added into the Confluence page, like in this case, those are also directly synced with the Hugo application, and it uses the webhooks to know when a change has happened in Confluence and then publishes them into their product directly. So, I've kind of explained now the two different use cases that there are. First, the ability to use macros as a way to bring your existing product and its content into Confluence directly. And the second use case, if you have a product and you want to integrate Confluence with your product, how you can use webhooks and how you can integrate creating content into your product. In conclusion, I want to take you back again those 6 years. Because even back then, with my limited knowledge, I was still able to have impact on my team using Confluence. But there were other teams, and all those other teams were using other products. And this is where we need your help, because the situation hasn't changed from 6 years. There are many products being used, and with your help, we need to make the cloud be more connected. The cloud products need to talk better with each other, because this way you will enable users not just to have an impact with their team, but to have an impact with their whole organization. And you, ecosystem developers, can make that happen. Thank you.
All right. So we have a few minutes for Q&A, and then you can fill out the survey and let us know how we're doing. So anyone have any questions for Klaus? Wow, awesome. I guess you've answered all the questions in your talk.
Yeah. If you have any questions on Confluence ecosystem, just reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk. I'll be here today and tomorrow.
Awesome. All right, thank you.